Hello. Welcome to today's webinar, your invitation to a different kind of living, the Beatitudes Project webinar with Stu G and some of his friends. We're so glad that you have joined us today. My name's Peter. I'm on the team with Stu and I help him out with the Beatitudes Project. And I was going to say good afternoon because I'm here in England, but some of you are probably in the States, so good morning. But just wherever you are in the world, I hope you're having a really good day, whether that is morning or afternoon, however much the day you've had. So great that you've chosen to join us today. I'm going to be handing over to Stu really quickly because I know that there's some great content that we just want to get to really soon. But it would be just a little bit of housekeeping. It would be great if in the chat you were just to say hello, tell us where you're watching us from. We love to hear that kind of stuff. So please introduce yourself in the chat. At any point today, you might have a question and we want to answer your questions. We definitely do. And we're going to be doing that at the end of the webinar. So there's a little tab that says ask a question. You can ask a question in there. You can upvote the questions you like. You can downvote the questions you don't like. And so please, if you've got a question, ask that in the question tab. That means that when we come to the Q&A at the end, we're able to backtrack and follow all the questions all the way through. I'm going to hand over to Stu now because I know there's so much content he wants to get through. But I hope that today's webinar helps you live differently in 2021.
It's so good to be with you. If you can bring Shane up as well, that'd be brilliant. And there we are. Shane, welcome.
Yeah, man, I've been counting the hours until we get to do this thing, bro. Great to be with you.
It's great to be with you too. So thank you to Red Letter Christians for the Beatitudes Bash and we are at the beginning of a series with the Red Letter Christians and also at the beginning of a series with the Beatitudes Project. We're going to be doing a webinar once a month just to kind of, help us live a bit differently. That's the aim of it all. So just in case you're new to the Beatitudes Project and what have you, my name is Stu G and for many years I was part of a band, a guitar player and songwriter in the band called Delirious from the UK. And over 10 years ago, we moved to America. I still play guitar. I still write songs, but I'm really passionate about the Sermon on the Mount and about the Beatitudes. And so that passion led to the creation of something called the Beatitudes Project that Shane very kindly lent his voice to. It's music and it's book, it's art, it's film, it's curriculum, and it's all wrapped up in an online eCourse called the Beatitudes Project. So Shane, it's been so much fun over the last 12 years. Actually, we've known each other since we released a record called Kingdom of Comfort, and caught up with you in the UK and what have you. But we've done, we've our paths have crossed, and we've been working on some amazing things over the years.
Absolutely. And I think what we got in common is this love for Jesus and for the Beatitudes. And that's where, Red Letter Christians gets its name. If y'all aren't familiar, is the old Bibles that have the words of Jesus highlighted in red, right? And in Gandhi, one time he was asked about Christianity and he said, "I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians acted more like him." And I think there's a lot of us that, kind of resonate with that. So that's, I think, what you and I have in common, Stu, is we want to center Jesus and we want a Christianity that looks more like Jesus, that loves like Jesus, that acts like Jesus. And the Beatitudes, I think, really represent the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. So I'm pumped to think about them with you today.
Yeah. Fantastic. So the aim of today is to kind of, we're going to look at all the Beatitudes and kind of scratch the surface because we can go so deep, but there's going to be many events over the next 10 days or so that can help us understand these things, go a bit deeper, and also just want to point everyone to our resources at thebeatitudesproject.com as well. But we want to give some great new content this morning. If you're familiar with the project, you'll see some things that you haven't seen before, hear from some people you haven't heard from before, and also we have a little exclusive bit of music with Amy Grant. So that's going to be amazing. But I think that as we are the first event in the Beatitudes Bash, I think we should read the Beatitudes. Actually, Shane, you were saying that this morning in
Yeah, it's crazy.
book of prayer.
Jonathan, my friend Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who maybe some of you have read his books. He's been a dear friend. We had the honor of crafting this common prayer book that's a compilation of lots of different hundreds of years worth of prayers and readings. And this morning's reading, September 2nd, is Matthew 5, which is the Beatitudes, which is just, I mean, this is once a year, that we do that reading, and it happens to be this morning. So
Wow.
I got chill bumps. It's just one more reminder that it feels like the Spirit has been uniting our hearts in this week. And there's no better way to kick it off than the Beatitudes Project and what you've been doing, because you've been thinking about this for years and years. But this whole week, for 9 days, we're going to be looking at the Beatitudes with Common Hymnal, with 9 Beats Collective, with like all kinds of Mark Scandrett, Danielle Strickland, all kinds of folks. And we're going to read Dr. King's speech on September 11th, which is the 20th anniversary of the attacks on 9/11. So all of that centering Jesus, because the Beatitudes are such a contrast to our knee-jerk reaction and to many of the cultural values of the world around us. So I think we should kick it off by reading them, don't you, Stu?
Yeah, I think so. Let me do it with my English accent here. And so chapter 5, I'm going to read from the NIV. There's just so amazing versions of the Bible out there, but this is one that is very familiar to me. So chapter 5, Matthew chapter 5. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and justice, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness and justice, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And we're going to leave that there. But amen, right?
Amen.
These Beatitudes are counterintuitive. They're subversive. They're things that are so familiar to so many. We learn them in Sunday school as kids, but we don't really get to dive deep on them like we're doing. So they're subversive. They're like this upside down way of Jesus. And I want to just talk quickly about some core ideas that we've used in the Beatitudes Project. And if there's something that I'd love you to take away today, it's this idea that the blessing is presence. Like the blessing is present. So we talk about, blessed are the poor in spirit, like those who have nothing left, the spiritual zeros, as Dallas Willard says. When you get to the end of your rope, as Eugene Peterson said, you're blessed at the end of your rope, like when there's nothing left. Like God is on your side, like God is with you. The everlasting love of God is on your side. And so this idea that what the blessing is presence. I remember, Shane, you said something like we've got the idea of blessing all wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, what we're accustomed to thinking of God's blessing is asking God to bless whatever it is we're doing, and so we kind of do what we feel is right in our heart, or whatever we want to do, and then we ask God to bless it. Whereas when you look at these Beatitudes, and actually you look at blessing throughout the Bible, and it's not the God bless America version. It's actually more, if you do this, you will bless God, and or if you care for the poor, God will bless you. And in the Beatitudes especially, you see God blessing the very people that this world is crushing, right? I mean, like the people that are marginalized. No one is seeking to be meek. We want to be bold and we want to be brave, and so I think but this is what we see in Jesus, and it's not a passiveness. It's not like but it's this courageous love that we see at the heart of all of these. So the way I think we should think about the Beatitudes, if we align ourselves with the poor, the merciful, those who are mourning and grieving in our world, we're going to be near to God. Like God is near to those who are hurting, those who are being persecuted, those who are poor in terms of material possessions in this world. Like even Jesus embodies all of that, shows us that God didn't even just come to serve the poor. God was born a refugee in a brown-skinned body, died executed on a cross. So our invitation is to move near to the suffering of the world, near to those who are marginalized. And if you want God's blessing, that's where it is. You show up rather than just kind of doing whatever it is that we want to do and just hoping God will bless it. And I think that's how we end up asking God to bless things that are a direct contradiction to these Beatitudes, right? We're going to ask God to bless wars and bombs and militarism rather than the peacemakers and the poor. So it's kind of the exact flip on that blessing. But I think you said it well, Stu. As you guys are reading this, some of this becomes I would use the word fluffified, like hallmarked, and it becomes cliche. So just step back and try to hear this with fresh ears, because you begin to see how counterintuitive it really is. I mean, almost the upside downness of the kingdom of God.
Let's put down what we think we know of the text and listen with fresh ears. So so the Beatitudes aren't like a list of things to attain, right? They're announcements of where God is blessing. And so the invitation, if the blessing is present, like God is on your side at these moments, in these circumstances, then the invitation is for us to be present. So this big idea of like the blessing is presence, and then the invitation is for us to be present. So we push into what God is blessing, right? There's an invitation to engagement and listening. What does it mean to listen? Like the people on the hillside listened 2,000 years ago. Where we've still got these words nowadays and they're changing lives. Like that's an amazing thing. Like the fact there was no devices, no notebooks, no recording things, and no band to warm the people up. It was like we've got these words that was like an oral tradition, and somehow like these words are not just good ideas, but they are like spoken by the Son of God, right? They're in the power of the Spirit. So so what does it mean to listen like that, so that we can have the conversations of difference and what have you? So, and then the other big idea is that this is a pursuit of transformation. Like it's not just about doing stuff. Like I want to be changed. I want to, like, if the blessing is present, like what do I do with that encounter with the presence of Jesus, right? So it's a pursuit of transformation. It's not just about doing stuff. So anyway, like I said, the first thing we look at in the project was, what does it mean to listen? And I've kind of talked about that, but because these are a list of pronouncements, like God is on your side when you are poor in spirit, when you are mourning. Like, so what does it mean to hear that and act with that? So, God is with us in the act of listening to each other. And another thing that my friend Rabbi Joseph said was that engagement is greater than tolerance. And so like we engage with people as we listen to their stories, like listening to understand, as my friends at the Telos Peacemakers group talk about, listening is so important. And so like the invitation for us today is to begin over the next few days to listen, to understand, like listen to what the Spirit of God is saying through these words that we have written down, the Beatitudes, and let's hear the invitation to live differently. Jesus was the Son of God and the Word made flesh, living among us, and so we've still got the voice of Jesus today through these words. So poor in spirit, like blessed are the poor in spirit. In the project we looked at like the literal poor, extreme poverty. We traveled to India and we spent time with the poorest of the poor, and we then we looked at what does spiritual poverty look like to someone who's a multimillionaire. Like, we went to Wall Street and interviewed a guy called Sam Polk, who earned millions and millions of dollars, and he talked about addiction. And he talked about depression. He talked about the love of money, actually. And but Shane, you've also got history with India. You spent time with Mother Teresa and in Calcutta. And yeah, I just wondered if just a few words on like poor in spirit. I think actually, that Matthew is clever with his language. In Luke, we see Jesus say, "Blessed are the poor," right? And then I think Matthew kind of like expands it to his audience, who are probably a little bit wealthier, right? So so it is extreme poverty, like that will crush your spirit, but so will reaching the bottom of an addiction, right? And depression. So yeah.
Well, first of all, Stu, since I'm in Tennessee, I've been back and forth, from Philadelphia to Tennessee. I'm in Tennessee now, and I've got, here on my desk, my little Mother Teresa picture.
Wow.
And she actually gave me that little medal. She gave them out. I got a few things she gave me here, but she's a big inspiration. And just to be fair, Stu, I also have Dolly Parton there. It says to Shane love Dolly Parton. So that's for you, man. Two women that have inspired me in different ways. But yeah, I mean, Mother Teresa is one of those that she left so much, and she talks about the poor with this sense that I can remember I worked in India with her, and when she was still alive, and I worked in the Home for the Dying, which was her first home that she started, and she was really known to give you a little scolding if you didn't put enough gravy on the rice or enough vegetables in the platter, that you're feeding people. She would say, "You're feeding Jesus, so make sure you're serving someone like you are serving Jesus." And she, in fact, said that in the poor, if we really look, and if we really are attentive, we can see Jesus in his most distressing disguises. We can see Jesus in the face of the poor. So you're not just serving some beggar, you're serving Jesus in disguise. And I think, in this beatitude, when Jesus blesses the poor, you make a really good point that Matthew says poor in spirit, but Luke says poor, like dirt poor, and even goes on to say, woe to those who are rich. Blessed are the poor, woe to those who are rich. So sometimes we kind of sugarcoat this just to be a spiritual poverty, and Jesus is not actually talking about wealth, whereas he actually does. But I think what he's showing us is the emptiness of it all, right? Mother Teresa said, the more we have, the more stuff we hide behind. Woo! Right? That our possessions begin to possess us. We begin to be owned by the things that we own. And I think that's the freedom that Jesus teaches us, that we're to live like the lilies and the sparrows. They don't worry about tomorrow. And there's this freedom in the sense that God will provide, that I think sometimes we get so obsessed with thinking we've got to provide for tomorrow. And over Jesus contradicts that, saying there was a guy that had a lot of stuff, so much stuff he couldn't even get it into his barn. He had to build a bigger barn to put it in, and God just crumbles it all, right? And says, that we're not to like stockpile for tomorrow while people don't have enough for today. But I think you also point out, that there is a poverty beyond just the material things. And that's where Mother Teresa, when she came to the United States, she notoriously said to this like Ivy League graduation, she said, "I've never seen such poverty as I see here, because you've got this deep loneliness." In some of the wealthiest countries in the world, we have the highest rates of loneliness, depression, and self-medication, suicide. And so there is that part of it, that we can gain the whole world and lose our soul. We can have all the possessions in the world and still end up very poor in our spirits. And so that's why it does transcend the stuff. But Jesus is also talking about material stuff in these. Jesus is talking about how we have a right to stockpile more than we need while someone else has less. And to that, he says, woe to you who are rich, and blessed are those who have so little.
That's amazing. Thank you, Shane. So you know, in the Beatitudes Project on this theme, we All Sons and Daughters wrote a brilliant song with me on that, so that's on there. And we've also on the eCourse, we've got some kind of spiritual practices and meditation. So we've got like it's like, how do we respond to it? And so we have some prayers, and we have like a little encouragement to how we can offer our presence to the poor and the poor in spirit. And just know that, like, if you're at the end of your rope, if you are suffering today with a depression, that God is on your side. And and the knowledge of that can change everything. So there we are. So blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. You know, that, like, how can mourning and grief be blessed? You know, it's like impossible to kind of get your head around, but something happens. This is about the grief of change, right? So, like, perhaps we have lost someone dear to us, but also perhaps we have lost a career. Perhaps we've made a really terrible mistake and lost a relationship. Perhaps we have just received a terrible diagnosis, right, on our health, and it's like something comes along and knocks us off track. Like, something comes along and knocks off track, and Jesus is saying that you're blessed if you mourn. It's like, and so we have to be present. Like, and I think that this idea of the blessing is presence. Like, God is on your side. Like, there's nothing that isolates us more than grief. You know, it isolates us. We we go into this terrible loneliness. We feel like the world is carrying on for other people and not for us. And I had an amazing conversation. I had an amazing thing happen. Like, this is after we'd created the project, written the book, all that kind of stuff. I met this couple from Northern California, and I was in a restaurant with them, and they had 40 of their friends, at least, around them, and they wanted to say thank you to these people for their presence in this great loss. So I'm going to hand over to this video now that I interviewed them just this week. So Eric and Hannah, thank you so much for joining us for this Beatitudes webinar today. We've got to blessed are those who mourn, for they should be comforted in the Beatitudes. And it was early 2019 that I got to meet you. We were on tour in Northern California, and I got to spend a day that I'll never forget with you.
Yeah, it was fun to get to meet you, and sadly, why it came for certain reasons, but it was such a blessing for us to get to meet you guys on that trip. And obviously, the little bit of background was in November of 2018, our daughter Elena was a victim of the borderline shooting where 12 people lost their lives in Thousand Oaks, California. Elena was a freshman at Pepperdine University and a bit of a nerd. So her mom and I had encouraged her to go out line dancing with her girlfriends. And then that night we got a phone call. And, I think it's hard to explain because I would never imagine the experience or want people to. But when we got that phone call, partly the faith of Hannah and her belief, I think we got immediately, it felt like we knew. But at the same time, we felt God's grace. Like, there was almost an immediate acceptance in the sorrow. So obviously very emotional, but because she was with people that loved her and that were there for her, I think it was really important for us to know that we had such good support from the beginning. And we found that at the Pepperdine, in the Pepperdine community down in Southern California, as well as back home here in Napa. So, yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure that everyone watching, we're just so sorry for your loss. In the Beatitudes Project, we talk about that the idea of the blessing in blessed are those who mourn is the presence, right? It's the presence of God, and then the invitation to be present ourselves. And that night, we had a meal at your restaurant, and you had filled that with, I mean, there must have been 40 people there, I would think, that you were saying thank you to for coming around you. And it was such an example to me of what the presence of God looks like through people.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'd say that's, and of course I'm not going to get through this without feeling it. But that is where that we feel God. And like Eric said, it was really, I'd say that's God, right? Right away, which is where I get this emotion that right away I felt his presence with us. When we officially learned that she was one of the victims, I knew that we needed to go to Pepperdine and be in the chapel and just surround ourselves with him. Like that was what spoke to me the most. And in that, that's really, he's just always with us and shows that presence in people, like us meeting you and here in this place to speak about it. That is how he works through people who we've been blessed with, whether the 40 people that were in that room, that they were there from the beginning, and it's just, again, opening that space and not needing the written rules of how this should be. That's where I really feel that his presence has spoken to us in people. And then even like as I was driving here from work, Chris Tomlin's "Nobody Loves Me Like You" comes on, and I just feel the sun shining and the warmth from the sun. Those are those moments I also feel God.
Yeah. And
just I get so emotional about it because I feel so blessed that I can feel that. When people ask us, I don't know how you're doing this, and it's because of faith in God and that trust that we are not owed anything.
Right.
We are not owed, like the things that we believe we are owed are really actually, I mean, they're nice things, right? A nice home and family. They're beautiful, wonderful things. And what we've learned in our loss is that God's unfailing love, everything else, that's what's holding us together, and teaching us what that looks like every day, all the time, and not without emotion like this. I think that's the piece too, is that when you feel that blessing, it's not the blessing is that it goes away. The blessing is that in this, whenever and however it comes, he's with us.
Right. Gosh, thank you.
And that's the best way I can describe it.
Thank you so much.
With emotion.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, obviously can't imagine that kind of loss, and we're just so sorry and with you. I'm so glad that we met, and thank you for your kindness and your hospitality, and for sharing your story here today. And our prayers are with you, and I hope that we get to see you again very soon.
Thanks, Stu.
Thank you.
Wow, Shane, what a conversation. I just want to bring out something that Hannah said. She said, what we've learned in our loss is that God's unfailing love is everything. And she said, the blessing is not that it goes away. The blessing is that in this, whenever and however it comes, he is with us.
Yeah.
And you know, yeah, I mean, it kind of leaves you a little bit speechless, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think, as I listened to Eric and Hannah, I think a lot of things were coming across my mind and moving in my heart. And one of them is that, I mean, from the very beginning of the Bible, we see God near to those who are hurting. Like the inaugural act outside the Garden of Eden is a murder. Um, Cain killing his brother Abel. And it says that the blood cried out to God from the ground, and so we like, and actually my Jewish friends have helped me with this one, Stu.
Yeah.
The word is plural, the bloods, and they say it wasn't just in that incident. Anytime blood is spilled, it cries out to God. And they also said it's important that the verb is actually in the present tense. So this sense that when we hurt another human being made in the image of God, that cries out to God and God hears it. And we see, that even when the Israelites are being rescued, they cry out in their hunger. We're starving out here, and God pours out, bread from heaven. Jesus weeps when his friend Lazarus died. You think, I mean, here's God in flesh. People die every day. And yet for Jesus, that death had a name, Lazarus, and he weeps, And I think of even Jesus as the embodiment of God as he's being executed and facing his execution. He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? So y'all, I think when we feel that long loneliness, when we feel that grief that makes us feel like God might not even be there, isn't it amazing to think that Jesus even felt the absence? God felt the absence of God. That's part of what his humanity was about. As much as he was divine, he was also human. So anywhere we see people grieving, rather than the cultural pattern of moving away from suffering, our faith, our solidarity with those who suffer should draw us in. So when we see folks hurting from the hurricane, folks that are struggling with the coronavirus, rather than try to keep ourselves, away from it, we should move towards that, because that's what God does.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And yeah, I'm with you on that. So Eric and Hannah, they have a foundation called Elena's Voice Foundation. We're going to drop the link into the chat at some point for all these guests, actually. And their focus is that, Elena's, she might be gone, but her voice carries on. And they're advocating for mental health issues around gun violence. And so fantastic couple. Thank you. If you're watching, Eric and Hannah, thank you so much for sharing your story. And with all these videos and these interviews, they're kind of cut down. I realize that we are going to go long today, but that's what it is. But so we're going to put all these videos up in their long form somewhere. We'll make space for that. So thank you, Shane. Yeah, so God draws near to the brokenhearted, it says in Psalm 34:18. So the blessing is presence, like divine presence with us in our grief. And then like if I'm not grieving today, the invitation is for me to be present to someone who is. So so that's it. Thank you, Eric and Hannah. Next, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. I mean, this is such a huge part of the Beatitudes Project for me. We've actually combined this in this little interview that's coming up. We've combined meekness and hunger and thirst. So the classic way of understanding meekness is kind of power or strength under control. This kind of classic way of like imagine a horse, a stallion, and it being bridled, right? So so that's one way. But what about those who've had their power taken away from them? What about the overlooked and the underpowered? And they're the questions we ask in Who Are the Meek? Who are the meek around us? Who are the meek in our communities? Like perhaps it's the refugee, perhaps it's the person who's a different color than us, perhaps it's the mentally ill person down the road or the elderly person. So this really is about inviting us into the conversations of difference. And then hunger and thirst for justice and righteousness is about what do we ache for? What do we ache for now in 2021? Perhaps it's a global systemic ache, or perhaps it's a local thing, poverty in your neighborhood or something, or perhaps it's like the personal ache, the thing that we can't fix that's under our skin. We're talking about addictions and behaviors at that point. So, I've really briefly gone over that because we have an amazing conversation coming up with a guy called Jonathan Tremaine Thomas who lives in Ferguson, Missouri, and he has an organization called Civil Righteousness. And let's play this chat. It's a little bit of a longer one because we're actually covering 2 Beatitudes, but bear with us, and we'll be back with Shane in just a moment. With us, Jonathan Tremaine Thomas from Civil Righteousness. We met a few months ago at Catch the Fire Church Raleigh. You spoke, and I heard one of the most amazing talks on the conversation around racial justice and engagement that I've ever heard, and I'll never forget it. The title was "Relics, Robes, and the Reconciliation of All Things." Yes. We are going to have another conversation in January where you get the whole time and we can dive into some of that stuff because it was incredible. And seriously, you're one of my favorite speakers now.
Oh, wow.
But so we met there a few months ago. We have a connection through my sometimes boss, Michael W. Smith. You were in a film with him, right?
Absolutely.
Anyway, I'm so glad that you're able to be a part of this webinar. Yeah, so I'd love to just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing now with Civil Righteousness.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on this webinar. Civil righteousness is a movement that began as a message in our hearts several years ago, as we began to engage in kind of the gaps in our cities where the places of pain are, as it relates to civil unrest and the rising kind of national and international conversation on justice and equity. And we saw that there was a real gap in the body of Christ, not only theologically when it comes to how do we engage, but also physically in being present in the streets that were, really in the cities where there's been, intense unrest and conversations around what is righteousness, what is justice, and how should the church engage. So long story short, we're pursuing reconciliation and restorative justice through spiritual, cultural, and economic renewal, and really just going with God into those places where we've seen a lack of the presence of God and the people of God in these really important conversations.
Wow, that's incredible, and I'm so grateful to learn from you in these areas. And so in the Beatitudes Project, one of the big ideas in the project is the idea of what does it mean to listen. How do we listen to understand? And the other thing that you mentioned there about your presence on the streets, the idea of the blessing in the Beatitudes being presence, so it's not necessarily that all our situations get fixed, but God is with us in that. And but then it's not just the blessing, it's also the invitation, it's right. The invitation to be present. So when it comes to blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, we're talking about those whose presence is perhaps ignored, like those whose kind of power and strength is kind of taken away. So, the overlooked and the underpowered, or the meek can be many different types of people in our neighborhoods. But I wondered if you had some thoughts on that from your experience with what you're doing on the streets.
Absolutely. I think there are so many different aspects of our culture and global culture, American culture. We can look at society and we can look at history and we can begin to identify those who might even categorically be considered the meek ones based on whatever, various definitions we may personally have of what meekness is or what it looks like. But, when I look at who Jesus went to and who he chose to not only surround himself with as far as his leadership team, and just the diversity of that team, who were people in various cultural and societal positions of power, whether it's the tax collector, but who has power from the state, but yet he's also despised because of his role, what he does, a hated position. I think Jesus sets for us this framework of the diversity of the kingdom and of the reality that both those in positions of societal power or the homeless or the fishermen, he saw through the eyes of the Spirit where they really were and the level of poverty that they really lived in, as well as the level of grace and glory that they carried, no matter what position in culture they held. And so for me, I could see, the meekness that we need to begin to engage, or the places and the people that we need to engage. We really have to ask for the eyes of the Spirit to begin to say, okay, Lord, do I go and sit in the grass with the homeless community? And what does it mean to incarnate life and righteousness and love among the homeless in our community? But also the meek might be the police officer, the meek person in a. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but when we look at the poverty of soul and of spirit, where we need to bring the wealth of the love of God or the richness of the kingdom of God in a community and in a society, we have to say, Lord, from your perspective, who needs to experience the shalom or the completeness, the wholeness and the healing of God in this community, and be willing to go there and throw our lives and our relationships in a covenantal way behind seeing the presence of God be made known in those places.
Wow. I feel like we need to have a little pause for thought there. That's amazing. That kind of leads real nicely onto the next beatitude, which is, blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness. And that word that we get righteousness from, I know I'm talking to the knowledgeable here, but it is the Greek word is dikaiosune, which actually means righteousness and justice. And so, in your work, you actually have righteousness in your name, civil righteousness.
Right.
And but in terms of that kind of intercession for change and the movement of going into the gap and advocating, the question that we asked in the project is, what do you ache for? So JT, I'd love to ask, what do you ache for?
I really, as I began to think of God and his kingdom, in 1 Peter 2, we see where it basically encourages us to say that those who bear up under suffering have a God consciousness, that there's a blessing in bearing up under suffering for righteousness' sake. And, from my perspective, especially from my ethnic heritage, looking at my ancestors, my greats, those who came through the furnace of chattel slavery, there was a real revelatory understanding of the structure of the kingdom of God, the justice and the righteousness that comes from heaven, that really produced hope in them, enough hope that gave them the grace to bear up and endure the suffering of chattel slavery, and then the ensuing suffering post-slavery, just through the civil rights era and beyond. And so the ache in my heart when I think of the righteousness of God's kingdom, in Jeremiah 23, Jehovah Sidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. And then in Jeremiah 33, it goes from the person of righteousness to the place of righteousness. And when I think, okay, Jesus is the person of righteousness, and he's in us and he's become our righteousness, but now he working and living in us desires that the places where we live in this temporal realm begin to take on the attributes of his righteousness. And so when I think of Abraham, who it says longed for a city whose builder and maker is God, a city with foundations. What are those foundations? Righteousness and justice. That's what Abraham longed for. And I think that is the ache and the groan of all of humanity at some level. Like, we are longing for the city of righteousness and justice, the systems of righteousness and justice. And so that, I would say, that's my longing. I long to see, even, is there one place on the earth in our day, in our time, not just, in the day to come, in the fullness of times when Jesus comes back, but in our day, could we actually see a righteous expression of the government of God on the earth? Can we see a righteous economy or ecosystem in a city, in a region, in a community? I long to see that where I live. I want someone to be able to drive into the city, the zip code that I live in, and go, my goodness, God is here. If we lift up the hood on the educational system, wow, there's something of the divine nature here. If we lift up the hood on the governmental system, wow, there's something of the divine image here. Wow, if we look at the business and the real estate and the housing markets and if we go down the list of what constitutes the city, I long to see the city of God, maybe the prototype of the city of God, manifesting in our cities.
That's amazing. Well, I'm with you in that. So finally, do you have some kind, in the conversation that we're having, this meekness and this hunger and thirst, do you have just a final encouragement for people that are watching?
So I would just say, be encouraged and let's keep going after the way of God in our day and in our time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, JT, and I really look forward to the longer conversation in January. And we're just so grateful that you're a part of this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My gosh, so many amazing things there, right, Shane? This idea of the person of righteousness in Jesus, and then can we move to a place of righteousness? Where there's the foundations and the city and the systems. If we take the lid off, we see righteousness and justice. We don't want to forget that if you are underpowered, overlooked, if you've had your kind of strength taken away from you some way, like the announcement is God is on your side. Like, the presence of God is with you. For most of us watching, that probably is not our story, but the invitation is to seek and to ache for this righteousness and justice. And I cannot think of a time in my life where this message is not more prevalent.
That's right. That's right. And when I was listening to JT, Stu, I was thinking it's interesting that the Beatitudes don't say, "Blessed are those who want justice," but it's that hunger, right? And I think that's why we have these traditional Christian disciplines and practices like fasting, right? One of the reasons that fasting is important is because comfort is dangerous. If our belly is always well fed, we begin to forget those who are hungry. And so these are spiritual practices. They're good for our heart, but they're also things like fasting cause us to hunger and to remember that there are people whose bellies are aching in our world. And it's also why proximity makes all the difference. I heard that in what JT was saying too, is in Jesus, God becomes proximate, but God also invites us to be proximate with those who are suffering. And there's nothing that puts a fire in your bones for justice than when it becomes personal, whether it's gun violence, the death penalty, immigration. Until issues have names and faces, it's hard for us to just have the kind of hunger for justice that the Beatitudes talk about. Yes.
Can we put a human face on these issues? And when they become personal, like you say, it's a game changer. And Yeah, so right now I'm just thinking about the time we're in, and and I ache for change. I ache for a world with more compassion, with more empathy and sympathy. With more kind of engagement, and not just tolerance. Um, so I don't think we've lived in a more divided time. We probably have. But um, so I think that the Beatitudes and Jesus shows us the way to heal our divides. So these first four Beatitudes that we've been looking at have kind of been talking about a poverty of some kind, whether that is material things, spiritual things, a poverty of joy, like with grief, poverty of power and strength. One thing I'll say about the meek is that with a long conversation I had with Rabbi Joseph was we came to this conclusion that the meek are those whose presence is ignored. Like if we're talking about presence, like these are the people who are overlooked, and so and whose presence we ignored. So there we are. So we've been looking at this kind of poverty, and then right in the middle of the Beatitudes, we're invited to show mercy and to receive mercy. This is the hinge pin, if you like, into the invitations to begin to live differently, like to be transformed. And so the presence is for us, and but it's also at this point it starts becoming requirements for us to show it to other people. And I had an amazing chat with Amy Grant about mercy that we're going to show now. And just so you know, like we wrote a song back in the day for the project, and it's called Morning Light, and it's brilliant. And so we're gonna it's an exclusive right for the Beatitudes Bash, is that we did an acoustic video in Vince Gill's studio of me and Amy doing that song. So we have a little chat, and then we have the song, and so enjoy this and enjoy this moment of the invitation to show mercy. So Amy, thank you so much for writing the song with me back in the day, and all your kind of kind support for the Beatitudes Project over the years. And I remember calling Rabbi Joseph, my friend, and I said, hey, what do you think about this? I think that Blessed are the Merciful should be all women's voices and stories. He didn't even hesitate. He just said, you're absolutely right, because the biblical word for that we get mercy from is this word, forgive my accent, but rachamim. And he said there's a 3-letter root, rachem, and he said that means womb.
Really?
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many. He was like, it's compassion in action from the womb of God.
Oh, wow.
We sat down at a coffee table in a green room once, and he said, what's going on in your world? I told you about this project and my passion for the Beatitudes.
And can I tell you, and you talked about them like I had never heard anybody talk about the Beatitudes.
Wow. Thank you.
Because to me, even in the way I had processed it, the Beatitudes were in some way a measuring stick.
Right.
For really how Jesus wanted us to be. And you completely flipped the script. And on all of them. And just made me look at them a completely different way.
Well, that's amazing. And that's really the purpose of what we're doing with this webinar. We're trying to kind of get people to pay attention to the upside down and the counterintuitive nature of what Jesus was saying. And we kind of gathered around your lunch table with Gail Owens, who had spent 27 years in prison, and most of that time on death row. And we were just exploring what mercy looks like to someone who'd spent all that time on death row. And it kind of extended into the women of Thistle Farms. What does mercy look like to someone who's spent so much time in prison, guilty of what they've been accused of, or women who have, just had their lives destroyed by prostitution, addiction, trafficking, and yet they've found a place of mercy and love.
Yeah, I just, that lunch with Gail that day, It made me look at people imprisoned differently.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's so important for us to tell our stories and to listen to each other's stories, because when somebody says, you know, this is the road of uncertainty and loss of myself that led to where I wound up, then they're not just the person on death row. They're and especially for a woman, I mean, there's part of every story that we can relate to. There's part of every story. And I've learned so much from hearing the stories of the women at Thistle Farms. You know, I don't know what it feels like to live in an unsafe home as a 5-year-old. My home was safe. But as soon as somebody whose life in the present looks totally different from mine, but they say, when I was 5, my home was unsafe. Well, I'm right there with them with my compassion.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing. Even if you have a life that it looks like everything is together, there's still, for every person, there's the loneliness of the human journey. Yeah. It doesn't matter how many groups you're a part of, a band, we all have to come to terms with being alive on this planet with all of the inequity, with all of our own gifts and flaws. And we have to face ourselves in the mirror. And every one of us wants somebody to say, we just want a voice saying, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
I see you, and it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And there's rest.
Yeah.
And take a deep breath, and you are not in this alone. And to me, that's the response of mercy.
Yes.
Is, come on, roll that burden off. Speak your need. Maybe I can't fix it, but I can listen.
Yeah.
You know, and mercy is really the bedrock of any meaningful community.
Right.
Because, you know, mercy is the welcome.
Yeah. Thank you for the song. Thanks for being you and all the things that that people don't see you doing, like barefoot at the farm, you know, all the stuff you do that people don't see. So thank you for living it out, not just writing songs about it.
Thanks. I got lost when I left home, spinning my wheels all alone. I couldn't run far enough to get past the damage I had done. But I remember when and how it might have been. Close your eyes and lay down your head. Looks like you could use some rest. That's what she said. And when you wake up, you're gonna shine with the morning light again. I've met some strangers in my time. This one, she felt like a friend of mine. As long as I still draw another breath, I will hear those words of tenderness. 'Cause I remember back then, and how it might have been. Close your eyes and lay down your head. Looks like you could use some rest. That's all she said. And when you wake up, know who you are, my friend. What your life has been. But close your eyes and lay down your head. Looks like you could use some rest. That's what mercy says. And when you wake up, you're gonna shine with the morning light again.
Oh, I hope you all enjoyed that. Amy is such an amazing person, and very. I love chatting with her, you know. And so Shane and I have. Well, I've joined Shane in his work with to end the death penalty, and so you know, like. Talking about mercy and talking about Gail Owens' story, you know, she's sadly no longer with us, but it wasn't the prison system that killed her. So yeah, Shane, we've joined forces a little bit on that, haven't we?
Yeah, we have, man. That was so moving, and it reminded me that well, like we said, these issues have names, right? And that proximity makes all the difference in the world. That's why, you and I and many other pastors and faith leaders have asked the governor of Tennessee, Governor Lee, to go visit the men on Tennessee's death row and to pray with them. Half the men on Tennessee's death row have asked the governor just to come listen to what Jesus has done in their lives and to pray with them. And that's what, really, when I think about mercy, it doesn't get much deeper than those who maybe have done some of the most terrible things we can imagine. Do we believe that God's grace is big enough for anybody? Is anybody beyond redemption? And that's where the death penalty is so important, because it raises these really deep spiritual questions. I mean, this is bigger than a political issue. It's, do we believe that Jesus came not for the healthy, but for the sick? That he said it's not the righteous, but the sinners, that he's come and he's healing those. So the whole story is about how good God is, even when we're not.
Yeah.
And that proximity, I carry this with me, Stu. This is one of the guys that I met one of the first times I went to Tennessee's death row at Riverbend. And this guy who's no longer on death row, but he wrote me this. He said, and I carry it in my Bible. He said, Shane, just as I was sealing up the letter, I was moved off death row after 30 years there on death row. And he says, I just walked on grass a few seconds ago for the first time in 30 years. God is great.
Wow.
And that's what this is about, right? The merciful. Like when we think of mass incarceration, the death penalty, so much of how we're conditioned to think of justice is that what did you do wrong and what's harsh enough a punishment for what you did. And, as I listen to JT and I listen to Amy's song, the Bible raises a really different framework, right? Restorative justice is not just about getting what you deserve. It's about healing the wounds of sin, right? And making right what was wrong. And so I think that's what we're after, right? And that's what the Beatitudes point us to, is that mercy, blessed are the merciful, for me, is about a Savior who is very in touch with how evil we can be, what the evils that we are capable of doing, and yet shows us that we interact with evil not on its own terms. And even as Jesus exemplifies that so beautifully on the cross, forgiving those who are killing him as he's being executed. So it doesn't get much more countercultural than that. But I think that's, exactly what we're talking about. Blessed are the merciful.
Yeah. I think too, like there's a temptation sometimes in these things that we make these invitations, these beatitudes, about other people, so like we're talking about people on death row and like the big stories, but I just want to like bring it back to the personal too, because the Beatitudes are for every single person on the planet, right? So there's me, like, who are the accusers in my, I might not be trapped in a prison somewhere, but I'm trapped in my own mind a lot of the time, and in my own soul. The voices that I listen to, my accusers, like the people that or the things that imprison me, are often my own voice. So can we begin to show mercy to ourselves as well? Like the places that we have shame, the places that we have regret, the places that wake us up in the nighttime, that come out from our deepest shadow. And that really like leads into this next theme of blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And like I realize that we're going a little bit long, but so we'll go over this one. You can always look at the resources in the project, but we look at like, what is a pure heart? It's not just about moral purity. This is what we'd love to suggest, right? It's not just about moral purity, but this is about putting on a show, like and wearing a mask. Like Eugene Peterson, he said, you're blessed when your inside world matches your outside world. So like, we looked at the idea of true self and false self, and the false self is the bit of us that we show to everyone to be accepted in the world, right? And the true self is what's going on inside, and oftentimes they're separated, and the heart divides when we experience shame and regret for the first time. And so we put all that stuff down there into the shadow, where we can forget, where we think we're forgetting about it, right? So that we learn how to behave, so that we don't experience that again. And then that is such a dangerous thing, because that stuff's going to be like controlling us from the shadows, right? And so this idea of a divided heart, and perhaps a pure heart is an undivided heart, where people are seeing what people are getting, what they see, right? Where we are acting without that kind of pride self, without that kind of mask on, and without putting on a show. And in the Beatitudes Project, I wrote a song with Amanda Cook, and we had a real long chat about this stuff, about being ourselves and reconciling the areas of our heart, shadow and light, and what would it be like if we were able to live our lives and do our worship and from the shadow. Carl Jung, he said 90% of the shadow is pure gold. So let's bring like what we have into this in the shadows out into the light in ourselves, and let's begin to heal our hearts and realize that it's a journey. It's a journey. It's step by step, but it's possible with this counterintuitive king and his counterintuitive kingdom to begin the journey of putting our hearts back together and being a better person in the world. So that's the pure in heart. And then
just one thing to add to that, Stu, that was so good. And I think of, one of the folks that you and I share in common that we love is Rich Mullins. And so did Amy Grant, right? She loved Rich. And so, but one of the things that he was so honest with his contradictions, with his struggles, with his loneliness. And I think that's why people were drawn to him, was they realized that this isn't for perfect people. And I'm convinced that right now, people are not looking for Christians that are perfect. They're looking for Christians that are honest. And the problem is that too often we've acted like we're perfect. And we pointed fingers at everybody else. And I think there's a way that we can realize exactly what you're saying, that it's the cracks that let the light come in. And so that's what this pure in heart is about, that we're as kind of healthy as our deepest secrets are. And that's why, as we try to help each other become more like Jesus, a part of one of the great traditions of the church is confession, right? Being able to say, I'm sorry, to share our struggles with each other. So we need to be able to create those spaces where we can be honest about the impurities of our heart, even as we aspire to be pure in heart.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah, that's right. So, we what if God wants us to, what if he wants to give us a pure and undivided heart by reconciling all the broken pieces? Like, that's the thing there. So peacemakers, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. in the Beatitudes Project, we based this whole section on peacemaking in the Holy Land. We kind of embedded ourselves in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we asked the question, what are peacemakers? What are Israeli and Palestinian peacemakers doing there? How do they live their lives? And can we learn something for our own contested spaces here in the West, where we're not in a necessarily a violent hotspot, but we could do with a little bit of peace right now, right, Shane?
That's it, man.
Yeah.
Totally.
So I've got some friends called the Telos group, and we're going to have like a whole webinar with these and look at what peacemaking is like. But for this week, for this webinar, I had a chat with one of my friends, Sami Awad. He's a good friend of Red Letter Christians as well, and he's a Palestinian Christian peacemaker. And this is what he said about peacemaking. This is part of a longer conversation that we'll post up, but this is what he said about peacemaking.
Yeah, for me, there's a very specific calling to what it means to be a peacemaker, the way Christ teaches us to be a peacemaker. Many people think peacemaking is what we have developed in our secular Western forms, which is just engaging in peacemaking to reach a treaty or agreement, or to reach a situation of no violence or no conflict. And I think Jesus teaches us something completely different in peacemaking. Being a peacemaker, the way Christ engaged in peacemaking, means there is a sacrificial component in your work towards the other. And the sacrificial component is based for me on the creation of a loving relationship between you and your enemy. When Jesus calls us to be peacemaker, at the same time, he calls us to love our enemies. And then this is something that not many people are ready to engage in. It's easy for me to make peace with you, but as long as you stay there and I stay here, that means I create my bubble of security and I'll give you your little space as well. This is not the peacemaking that Christ calls us to engage in. He calls us actually to become one as one community, where all are welcomed and all are equal in the kingdom that he teaches us to live today in our lives. And so for us, when we engage in peacemaking, the way Christ teaches us peacemaking, it's a level of understanding that every act of violence has something behind it. We cannot justify the act, but we can understand what is behind it. And that's where that point that you're saying, we listen to the other. We hear the story of the other. Jesus was asking questions to people. He knew what the answers were, but he wanted them to express, to say in their words. Even he was asking them, what do you want from me? And he knew exactly the ailment that was in them. But that empowerment that each person had, I want to be healed, I want to be free. This is the empowering that we engage in doing peacemaking. So when I sit with Israelis, it's not about telling them how wrong they are and how bad they are. It's understanding that their actions of violence towards me actually come, and for the most part, this is what we see, from a place of fear and a place of trauma that needs to be healed. And this is where building trust and respect becomes a key component of peacemaking. And building relationships becomes important in peacemaking as well. And this is the challenge that we are up in today. How do we engage in peacemaking as a blessing towards the other, not just a blessing that we receive? When I'm a peacemaker, I am blessed for being one, because I understand that I have inherited something big. But in my blessing, I have to bless others as well.
Thank you, Sami. Incredible. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Stu.
Sami, and Shane, I know that you're good friends with Sami too. And one of the things about visiting the Holy Land is that all around the borders between Israel and the Palestinian territories, there's these 25-meter walls, right? And so like that spoke to me as like a modern kind of parable in some ways. That the idea of peacemaking is not just peace talking or peacekeeping, but the act of actually moving from behind our walls of security and onto the contested ground. Where and I think, you know, what Sammy said there about like listening to understand, like that's the first principle of peacemaking, you know. And something I learned from my friends there also was the idea of putting a human face on suffering. We've already talked about this, but you know, when we see our adversary, even our enemy, like as a God image bearing human being, and we listen to their story, perhaps we can hear some of the fear and some of the trauma. And one of the key things about a peacemaker is that they seek something called mutual flourishing, right? So it's the idea that I want for my neighbor what I want for myself. You know, I want for my adversary what I want for myself. So I want to live I want to have a roof over my head. I want my children to grow up safely. You know, I want, you know, access to healthcare and food and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I want that for my neighbor. I want that for my adversary. So these conversations are deep and complicated and long, but the essence is that peacemakers are blessed, and they're called
Come on.
the children of God.
Woo! Yeah. And you can almost be sure anytime you put a wall up to lock somebody out, Jesus is on the other side, right? And because Jesus is a reconciler. And one of the things that Sammy's been a friend of mine for a decade, I've been there to Bethlehem with them, you know. But he talks about part of his journey was actually going on pilgrimage to Germany, so that he could begin to understand what happened to Jewish people in history, went to the concentration camps, the Holocaust Museum. And he says, now I look at the wall differently. I don't just see hatred, I see fear. Right. And it doesn't justify the injustices that are happening now. But I think that humanizing of the other, I always hear that in Sammy's voice. And it's what Dr. King talked about. You know, Sammy said this, you said this, Stu, that, you know, Dr. King said that there's a counterfeit peace. And that's the devil's peace, right? It's the absence of conflict. That's not true peace. That's the devil's peace. True peace is the presence of justice, right? And that's why, you know, we when we think of peacemaking, I think we've got to remember that it doesn't mean passivity, but it's the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring that injustice. It's the act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer, the act of finding, you know, that third way that's neither fight nor flight, but the narrow way that leads to life, both for the oppressed and the oppressors, right? And that's why Dr. King, he's so powerful when he says, you can hate us, but we will still love you. No matter what you do, you burn down our houses, we will still love you. You threaten our children, we will still love you. You throw us in jail, we will still love you, but we will wear you down by our love, right? So that's the peacemaking that is willing to die, even for those who are trying to kill us. Woo! Come on, right?
Unbelievable. And so, you know, peacemakers are often persecuted, right? And so we get to the next beatitude: blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness and justice. And you know, I keep using the words righteousness and justice because of that word dikasune, you know, that means both of those things. And so you know, like staying true to the text, if you like, because Jesus then goes to say, for my sake, like the blessed are those who are persecuted for my sake. It's like, so, you know, there are many Christians in the world right now, like we're aware that that so many people, like the Open Doors Christian Advocacy Group, that their recent data said that more than 340 million Christians, that's 1 in 8 Christians on the planet, face high levels of persecution and discrimination because of their faith. You know, everyone is concerned right now what's going to happen in Afghanistan, for instance, as well, you know. And so there are places around the world that we should be praying for our brothers and sisters and being aware of them, and not ignore the fact that our brothers and sisters are being persecuted for their faith, sometimes being imprisoned, sometimes being killed. And there's, and I don't want to belittle that or go over that quickly, but you know, there's also this temptation in doing that we make it about people over there, you know, that we make this about other people who are somehow, you know, heroes of the faith, and we don't really think it applies to us. And so, like we had a conversation on the Beatitudes Project, Shane, about what does it look like to be willing to suffer for the kingdom, but to be willing to suffer, like, and what does it mean to be holy troublemakers in our day? Because the question is like, for me in this beatitude, like, blessed are the persecuted, like, the questions are, who am I colluding with? Like, what am I saying yes to, and what am I saying no to? And am I colluding with the powers in the world right now, like money, like sex, like violence, like racism, you know? And yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think of the words of Jesus when he said, "Woe to you when people speak well of you."
Right, yeah.
That's what they said about the false prophets, right? So we almost have to wonder if we aren't feeling some sort of collision with the dominant values and of our culture and our world. Are we really following the countercultural Jesus, the one, you know, whose scripture says that we are not to conform to the patterns of this world, but to
Right.
be transformed by the renewing of our mind, right? To live with
Yeah.
new imagination. So if we do seek first the kingdom of God, which is so upside down, where the last are first, the first are last, the mighty are cast from their thrones, the lowly are lifted, the rich are sent away hungry, and the poor are fed. Like, this is the pattern of the kingdom of God, and it's so such a reminder that if we're following that Jesus, we will be persecuted. We will be drugged before courts. You know, we will find ourselves colliding with some of the dominant patterns of the world around us. And if we're not, we almost have to ask ourselves, are we living with that different imagination? And it's hard. You know, I think that's why when we look at these Beatitudes, they are something we're pursuing, but they're also something we have to be intentional about, right?
Yeah.
Like Nelson Mandela says, we aren't born to hate, we learn to hate. And we are conditioned to hate other people. And so the good news is we can be conditioned to love, right?
Yeah.
We can unlearn hatred. We can unlearn violence, but we have to discipline ourselves. And I think that's part of why the word disciple shares the same root as discipline. You know, I mean, I don't get excited to go jog, Stu, but I'm trying to like run 7 miles whenever I can. And like, but when I start doing it, it's not easy at first, but I start to feel myself breathing better. And I think prayer, the spiritual disciplines are sort of like that. They're like holy habits. They're like spiritual exercises. We have to work ourselves. We have to exercise these things so that these do become our reaction. Because even Peter, when the soldiers came for Jesus, as much as he had heard about loving his enemy, heard the Sermon on the Mount live, and yet when the soldiers came, he still impulsively picked up a weapon. He took his sword, cut off one of the guy's ears, and Jesus scolds him and heals the guy that he wounded. And he says to Peter, you're not thinking with the mind of God. You're thinking from still this logic of this world. So this is why, you know, these are countercultural values. We're going to feel a collision with the world that we live in. But that's a sign maybe that we're actually following the one who was crucified, because you don't get crucified for just defending the status quo. You don't just get crucified for charity, and you know, you get crucified for interrupting the status quo and proclaiming a kingdom that is different from the world.
Yeah, my gosh, yes, with you on that. So you know, the idea here is not like we're not trying to be obnoxious. We're not like trying to get persecuted. Like, that's a silly kind of thing, right? But we are trying to live the way that Jesus sets out for us. You know, my friend Rabbi Joseph, he says that the Sermon on the Mount, you know, he is that Jesus is kind of pulling from Leviticus 19. He says, you know, this idea of be holy, for I am holy. Right. And how do you be holy? Well, you follow these commands. But, you know, Jesus is saying, like, you follow these announcements, like we push into what God is blessing, and then and we allow our lives to be changed. And, you know, earlier I said, what does it look like to listen like what does it mean to listen like the people listened in the day, you know, back in the day? And, you know, these aren't just words. They aren't just wise words that have been written down. They are words that are in the power of the Holy Spirit, spoken by Jesus, the Son of God, right? And so what do we do with that presence? Like, how do we respond to that? Because Jesus is speaking. Like, if we have ears to hear, he is speaking these words to us right now. So the idea of living with prophetic imagination and being open to the presence of God, and to encounter that and to be transformed, like, that is what we want, right, Shane?
That's it, man. And I think, the last thing I'll share is I think that this transformation begins inside of us,
Yeah.
right? Like, we're looking at these, we're praying that, as Paul said, that the life I live, I would no longer live, but Jesus would live inside of me and through me, right? That my, like the Spirit I would be so transformed that people see me living differently in the world. But it's also about the transformation of the world, right? That we are seeking that this world would be a world where the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers are lifted up, that becomes the norm, right?
Yeah.
And so, one of the verses that really inspired the early Christians was the prophet Isaiah, as you said, this prophetic announcement that the world can be different. And they said, God's people will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning hooks.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says, we will learn violence no more. So it begins with us. I mean, that text of Isaiah begins with people that are so tired of the grieving of lives lost to violence. They're so tired of the violence of war that they begin to transform metal that was crafted to kill into metal that is crafted to cultivate life. So tomorrow, Stu, as you know, I'm going to Texas, and we're going to we have an AR-15 that's donated, and we make these garden tools out of them. And I make these heart necklaces. And I thought of our friends, Eric and Hannah, and their daughter that was killed. And every time I crush a gun barrel into a heart, I think of all the hearts and the lives that have been crushed, by gun violence. So we're that's part of what we're doing. But that verse, it was so inspirational to the early church that they said, this is who we are to be in the world. We're people that are transformed ourselves, but we're also envisioning the world differently. And the prophets, as Walter Brueggemann said, the prophets were not just fortune tellers trying to predict the future.
Yes.
They were truth tellers that were trying to change the future by waking us up, right, to how we're living now and going, the world doesn't have to be this way. The kingdom of God is something we're to usher in on earth as it is in heaven. So these Beatitudes, may they inspire us to be changed, but may they also inspire us to change the world so that it looks a little bit more like what God dreams for this world to be. That's
amazing. That's brilliant. So, folks, thank you so much for joining us. We are so appreciative. Shane, thank you so much. Like, I
thank
love
you, brother. I'm so grateful for you, man. And thank y'all for joining in. Keep tuning in. This is just the beginning. I mean, I'm so excited about everything that you're doing with the Beatitudes Project, and we're going to keep singing that same song together. You'll do the singing, I'll do the preaching, but but we, and those of you that are tuning in this week, we got stuff happening almost every day this week with the Beatitudes Bash. This is the kickoff, but we'll have, tomorrow we'll be going down to Texas. We'll live stream the transformation of the AR-15, but we also have 3 survivors of gun violence that are going to share their grief and their stories as we remember that God's blessing them. So stuff's going on all week, but it's just my privilege, bro, to always be with you. I love you, and I'm grateful for all you're doing with the Beatitudes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so. And so we would love to, we've had to kind of skip over a lot of stuff, and kind of skim the surface. And we'd love to point you towards our resources at the Beatitudes Project, and encourage you all to tune in for all these webinars on the Beatitudes Bash coming up. Peter, over to you.
Stu, Shane, that was absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure you've been reading the comments. Everyone seems to be absolutely loving it. Like I was saying at the beginning, my name's Peter. I help Stu manage kind of the back end. When I say the back end, I just mean the bit that no one sees of the Beatitudes Project. And, so I'm kind of just helping him host today's webinar, and just want to say thank you so much for sticking around to the end. There's so many of you been sat watching. I know that we're about to get to questions. I know that Shane is still around for questions, and there's some great questions that have come in. So we'll jump to those really quickly pretty soon. But, we obviously, this webinar is part of the Beatitudes Bash that Red Letter Christians are hosting over the next, 9 to 10 days. And we did this for free because we fundamentally believe that the Beatitudes can help you live differently in 2021. In the crazy upside down world we live in, the Beatitudes can help find us a way through. And so as Stu was explaining, the Beatitudes Project was started off as an album, and then started off album, documentary, book, started off somewhere started off as an album, probably deep inside Stu's heart, and turned into a documentary and a book and so many different things. And about a year ago, we turned all the different collateral that Stu had created. So this documentary and small group resources and album and interviews and podcasts and all kinds of different things that had happened, we turned into an eCourse. And because we wanted to enable lasting transformation, and we didn't believe that it could happen through a 45-minute documentary or 45-minute webinar, but really an immersive learning experience. And so that includes, it includes a whole bunch of contributors. Shane's on there, Amy Grant's on there, Michael W. Smith's on there, Stu's friend, Rabbi Joseph, Joel Houston, Martin Smith, a whole bunch of people. And it's over 10 weeks. There's a teaching film in there. There's all the songs from the album. There's weekly meditations and prayers and study notes and theological conversations and free artwork and poetry. And you're understanding the list is pretty much endless. So I'll stop reading it out now. So if after today you're going, I want to delve more into the Beatitudes, we really do believe that the eCourse is the next step for you. And then here's the best news, and I'll let Stu kind of maybe explain a little bit about this. We have made the Beatitudes eCourse pay what you feel, because we wanted a pricing plan that was in the spirit of the Beatitudes. So we have 5 different pricing options for you, but basically you can pick, including free, you can pick what price you want to pay. Stu, do you want to just talk a little bit about that? Because I know that was kind of your idea, basically.
Yeah. I just wanted to, whatever we do, I just wanted to embody the spirit of the Beatitudes, and it's hard to justify saying blessed are the poor and then to say, but we want to charge you 100 and whatever for the eCourse. And so, but there are people out there that would like to, because we that are able to pay, and there are things that we'd love to do and to continue with the Beatitudes Project. But yeah, this is just to say that if you can't afford it, or if you can't afford it right now and maybe can come back later, we've got a donate button. So this isn't about getting your money. This is about offering the Beatitudes Project to you.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you everyone so much. I know we probably kept you a little longer than we thought we would. So thank you everyone so much for sticking around. It's been great. If you, like we were saying, if you would like to delve more into the Beatitudes, you can pay for our eCourse what you feel by clicking the pay what you feel button. Really hope that encourages you and helps you in your journey of transformation. And absolutely hope you have a great rest of your day, great weekend, all those kind of things. Stu, thanks so much. Shane, if you can hear us, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. It really means so much. Thank you so much for being with us, and God bless. And don't forget to watch all the other to join all the other webinars in the next 10 days.
Absolutely.